Hello, my name is Carl Reinhardt, book analyst, and today we will be discussing the things they carried. Today we have Tim O'Brien, the author, the young soldier Tim O'Brien, and Jimmy Cross to discuss how Tim O'Brien, the author, uses the setting of the waste field to describe the horrors of war. Within the chapter In the Field, the setting plays a very strong role. Today I will be talking to the author and a couple of characters in order to analyze what the waste field symbolizes.
Hello, I'm Tim O'Brien, the author.
And I'm Jimmy Cross. Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm the young soldier who is also Tim O'Brien, the character.
So, Jimmy, can you tell us about your experience in the field looking for Kiowa?
Being out there was very tough to say the least. I still struggle with the regret I feel towards Kiowa's death. I watched the nasty field in Vietnam and the country as a whole take him physically and mentally. It stripped him of his morals, and Kiowa wouldn't be Kiowa without his morals or his faith.
That's a very good point, Jimmy. The book quotes, "The rain has fallen without stop, and the Song Trebong has overflowed its banks, and the muck has now risen thigh-deep in the field along the river." So, Tim O'Brien, why did you choose to make it a waste field, and what does that symbolize?
As the author, I really wanted to capture the horror of the war as a whole and how many of the soldiers connected the horror of the war with Vietnam as a whole. By Kiowa being sucked into the waste field, which was literally a part of Vietnam, I illustrated how the men could literally get sucked into the war and the land and the country as a whole. Just like Jimmy said, the war changed men. Men came in with morals and left with different to no morals.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the author on this point. Kiowa was my greatest friend in the war, and he was a man of faith. He had high morals, and he held himself to them. But the war still changed him. It corrupted him. It was only fitting that the filthiness of war would ultimately consume him just as it did to the rest of us. The author does a great job at conveying the war as beautiful. But when it comes to the waste field, he does a brilliant job at conveying the horror, filthiness, and corrupt parts of the war. Watching my best friend get sucked into Vietnam was terrible, but having to continue fighting for something I knew nothing about was worse. The waste field represents all of that.
Those are all great points. The book talks about how the field is when he returns with his daughter as well. The book states, "A few months after completing In the Field, I returned with my daughter to Vietnam, where we visited the site of Kiowa's death, and where I looked for signs of forgiveness or personal grace or whatever else the land might offer. The field was still there, though not as I remembered it. Much smaller, I thought, and not nearly so menacing. And in the bright sunlight it was hard to picture what had happened on this ground some 20 years ago. Except for a few marshy spots along the river, everything was bone dry. No ghosts, just a flat grassy field. The place was at peace." What do you guys think about how the field that was once filled with waste was then clear and being used for farming in the chapter, Field Trip, when O'Brien returns years later with his daughter? How is this symbolic?
Well, the period of time I fought in that war was probably the worst of my life. That field and that night where everything changed is one that will forever be engraved in our memories. The waste field is representative of Vietnam and how after all this time it is cleared up like the field itself. I think O'Brien took his daughter there hoping to help her understand what the war meant to him and how important this field was. At the time, it didn't look like much to her, and as a young girl she truly can't understand it, but Tim knows that he needed to revisit the site because that night will always be a part of him.
Yeah, like Cross said, that field that was once filled with so much waste is clear now after all these years, and it's like our lives. They were consumed with horror during the war, but like the field we've managed to change and carry on.
Yeah, I think that going back to the field gave closure not only to O'Brien but to the readers. It was necessary to return to complete the analogy of the horror that was once represented in war. Just like the young soldier said, the cleanliness of the field after the war represents how the soldiers' lives are now. It doesn't mean the filthiness was never there, but it just means that somehow they have managed to clean it up and go on with life. The horrors that were experienced by the soldiers in the Vietnam War can never be erased, but they can be dealt with.
Yeah, that is an awesome point.
Yes, of course.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. This podcast couldn't have been possible without all you guys. Until next time.